Mortimer Knox carried the sealed envelope in the inside breast pocket of his black wool funeral coat. From the moment he left his law office at 7:30 on the morning of the funeral until the moment he sat down at the head of the long mahogany table in the front library of the Hallam House at 11 o'clock that same morning to read it aloud, and he kept his right hand resting on the wool of his coat over the envelope for the entire 3.5 hours, because he had understood by Tuesday afternoon that the three sons of Cyrus Hallam were not going to permit the letter to be read if there was any way left to them in which they could destroy it first. He was 67 years old that May, and he had been Cyrus Hallam's lawyer for 31 years. And in those 31 years, he had drawn up 4 versions of the will of Cyrus Hallam, and he had drawn up the last version on a clear afternoon in the autumn of the previous year, and at the same sitting, an additional sealed letter to be read aloud at the will reading in the presence of all named beneficiaries, which had then sat in his iron safe for 8 months, and which he had retrieved from the safe on Tuesday afternoon, the day after Cyrus had died in his sleep of a heart trouble that he had been concealing from his sons for the better part of 2 years, and which Mortimer Knox had now been carrying against his ribs for 92 hours. He had not slept well in those 92 hours. He had slept in his clothes on the small leather couch in his back office on Tuesday night and Wednesday night, and he had slept on his own bed on Thursday night and Friday night, because by Thursday evening he had been so tired that he had walked home anyway and had taken the chance, and he had kept the coat on while he slept on his own bed both nights. And his housekeeper, Mrs. Prine, had looked at him on Friday morning when he came down for breakfast in the same coat she had pressed for him on Monday afternoon, and had said, in the careful voice of a Welsh housekeeper of long service who knew when her employer was not to be questioned about the small things, "More coffee, Mr. Knox?" He had said, "Mrs. Prine, yes." He had drunk the coffee. He had ridden the small bay gelding to the law office that morning with the letter in the coat. He had ridden to the Hallam House at 20 minutes to 11 with the letter still in the coat, and Edgar Hallam had been standing in the front hall waiting for him. Edgar Hallam had said, "Mortimer." Mortimer had said, "Edgar." Edgar had said, "My brothers and I would like a word with you in the small parlor before the reading." Mortimer had said, "Edgar, the reading is in 20 minutes." Edgar had said, "It is a small word." Mortimer had said, "Edgar, I am happy to speak with all of you after the reading for as long as you would like." He had said, "Before the reading, no." He had said, "Please excuse me." He had walked past Edgar Hallam into the front library, where the long mahogany table had been set for 9. The 3 sons, their wives, the senior bank clerk, Mr. Beasley, the parish minister, the Reverend Holcomb, Mortimer himself, and one Orc woman who had not yet arrived, but for whom a place had been set at the foot of the table on the explicit written instruction of Cyrus Hallam in the body of his last revision of his will. The Orc woman's name on the place card at the foot of the table was Thessa of the Coldfern clan. Mortimer had set down his small leather portfolio at the head of the table, the empty portfolio he had carried into the house as a piece of theater, so that the 3 sons would think for as long as possible that the letter was inside it and not inside his coat, and he had stood beside his chair, and he had taken out his pocket watch, and he had begun to wait. The story had begun on Monday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when the runner from the Hallam house had come to the door of the law office and told Mortimer that Cyrus Hallam was dead. The runner had been a young boy of perhaps 12 named Toby, who worked the stable behind the Hallam house, and Toby had been crying. Mortimer had sat with Toby on the front step of the law office for 10 minutes while Toby got the rest of the message out. The message was that Mrs. Prine, meaning Cyrus's own housekeeper, not Mortimer's housekeeper, the two women had been cousins, had gone up to Mr. Hallam's bedroom that morning to bring him the cold compress he had begun to keep on his pillow at night for the headaches he had been having, and she had found him in the bed, and his hand had been on the small framed daguerreotype of Mrs. Hallam he kept on the bedside table. The doctor had said it was the heart. The 3 sons had been notified. The eldest, Edgar, who had been at his own house 2 streets over, had come within an hour. The middle son, Floyd, at his dry goods store on Main Street, had come within 2 hours. The youngest, Henry, at the territorial capital studying law, and expected home for his father's birthday the following Saturday in any event, had been wired and was expected on the Friday train. Toby had been sent to fetch Mortimer Knox, the lawyer, because Edgar Hallam had asked Mrs. Prine to send for him. Mortimer had thanked Toby. He had given Toby a small silver coin for the run. He had locked the law office and walked the 4 blocks to the Hallam house in the cool late afternoon of a Monday in May, and Mrs. Prine had admitted him in the small back hall, and Mrs. Prine had said, "Mr. Knox, he is gone," and Mortimer had said, "Mrs. Prine, I am very sorry for your loss as well." He had spent the next 2 hours doing the small, careful things that a lawyer does in the immediate aftermath of the death of a man whose will he has held for 31 years. He had sat with the body for 20 minutes alone in the upstairs bedroom and had said the things he had been preparing to say to Cyrus Hallam for the 8 months since they had drawn up the last revision of the will, in the quiet, flat voice he had been practicing for those things. He had come back downstairs. He had sat in the front library with Edgar Hallam for an hour and had explained in general terms what would happen next, which was that the funeral would be held on Saturday morning to permit the youngest son, Henry, to arrive from the capital, and that the will would be read at the Hallam house on the same Saturday morning at 11, immediately following the burial at the church cemetery at 9, and that the will named Mortimer Knox the executor of the estate, and that the will named a number of beneficiaries whose names Mortimer was not going to disclose to Edgar in advance of the reading, and that all parties would receive their copies of the relevant documents at the reading. Edgar Hallam had said, "Mortimer." Mortimer had said, "Edgar." Edgar had said, "Is the Orc woman in it?" Mortimer had said, "Edgar, I am not going to discuss the contents of your father's will with any beneficiary or potential beneficiary in advance of the reading." He had said, "This is the standard procedure of my office and of the Territorial Bar Association and of your father's specific instruction to me in writing on the last day we sat together in this room." He had said, "The reading is on Saturday at 11. He had said, "You will know on Saturday at 11. Edgar had not said anything for a long moment. Then he had said, "Mortimer, all right." Mortimer had walked back to the law office in the dusk and had retrieved from his iron safe the sealed envelope marked in his own careful hand, to be read aloud at the will reading of Cyrus Hallam in the presence of all named beneficiaries, M.K., the 18th of September, and he had put it into the inside breast pocket of his black wool funeral coat, and he had not taken the coat off again until the morning of the funeral. He had been right to do so. The first attempt on the letter had been at 9 o'clock the next morning, Tuesday, when Edgar Hallam had come to the law office in person with a polite proposition that the three sons would retain Mortimer in his capacity as executor for an additional fee of $100 to be paid out of their own share, in consideration of which Mortimer would deliver to them that morning the sealed letter Mr. Hallam had reportedly attached to the last revision of his will, so that the three sons could review its contents in privacy in advance of the reading and decide whether the reading should proceed in its currently scheduled form. Mortimer had heard Edgar out. He had said, "Edgar, I am not your father's executor for hire." He had said, "I am your father's executor of record, by the document on file at the Territorial Probate Court in the Capital, which specifies in its 11th clause that the executor shall read aloud the sealed letter attached hereto in the presence of all named beneficiaries on the day of the will reading, and that the sealed letter shall not be opened by any party prior to that reading on penalty of forfeiture of the executor's commission and on penalty of criminal liability for tampering with the testamentary instrument of a deceased person under the Territorial Probate Code, Section 17. He had said, "Edgar, I am not going to forfeit my commission." He had said, "I will see you at the reading on Saturday." Edgar Hallam had stood in the front office of the law office for a long moment with his hat in his hands. He had said, "Mortimer, I am asking as a son." Mortimer had said, "Edgar, your father is the man who asked me to read this letter aloud at his funeral." He had said, "Your father is the only son in this matter whose request I am going to honor." He had said, "Please excuse me." Edgar had left. The second attempt had been at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, when Floyd Hallam, the middle son, had come to the law office without an appointment and without his hat, and had walked directly into Mortimer's back office and had set a small leather purse on Mortimer's desk and had said, $200. Mortimer had looked at the purse. He had looked at Floyd. He had said, "Floyd, take your money off my desk and walk out of my office." Floyd Hallam had said, "Mortimer, you have known us since we were boys." Mortimer had said, "Floyd, I have." He had said, "That is exactly why you should know better than to set a leather purse of $200 on this desk this afternoon." He had said, "Take it off." Floyd had taken it off. Floyd had said, "Mortimer, you are going to regret this on Saturday." Mortimer had said, "Floyd, on Saturday I am going to read your father's letter aloud in the front library of his house in the presence of his named beneficiaries, and you and your brothers are going to listen to it, and you are going to find out what kind of man your father was." He had said, "You are going to regret a great many things on Saturday, Floyd." He had said, "My reading of this letter is not going to be one of them." Floyd had walked out. The third attempt had been on Wednesday morning, when a man Mortimer had never seen before had walked into the law office and had identified himself as an agent of an insurance company from the Territorial Capital, and had asked Mortimer for permission to examine the contents of the iron safe in connection with an unrelated insurance claim by a third party against an asset of the estate of the deceased. Mortimer had asked the man for his credentials. The credentials had been forged. Mortimer had told the man, in the flat voice of a country lawyer who had handled forged credentials before, that no examination of the contents of the iron safe would be permitted to any party except a duly appointed officer of the territorial court bearing a warrant of inspection, and that the agent should leave the office immediately. The agent had left. Mortimer had walked the 4 blocks to the Pine Brook Sheriff's office and had filed a report. The sheriff, a man of 40 named Harlan Boyd, whom Mortimer had known for 15 years, had read the report and had nodded once. He had said, "I will put a man on your office door for the next 3 days." The man Harlan had put on the door had been a young deputy named Pell. Pell had sat on the front step of the law office from Wednesday evening through Friday evening with a long-barreled rifle across his knees, and had read 3 books out of Mortimer's library, and had eaten 2 of Mrs. Prine's meat pies, and no one had come to the office. The 4th attempt had come on Friday evening, 8 hours before the funeral, and it had not come from any of the 3 sons. It had come from the senior clerk of the bank, Mr. Beasley, a man of 58 who had worked under Cyrus Hallam for 34 years, and who Mortimer had thought of, until that evening, as a quiet, honest man of the kind banks are built out of. Mr. Beasley had come to the law office at 6:30. He had asked Pell on the front step whether the senior clerk of the Hallam Bank might have a private word with Mr. Knox on a matter of the bank's records, and Mortimer had said yes. Mr. Beasley had come into the back office. He had taken from his coat pocket a folded sheet of paper. He had set the paper on Mortimer's desk. He had said, "Mr. Knox, the 3 sons of Mr. Hallam have authorized me to convey to you the following revised offer, which is that the 3 sons will, immediately following the reading of the will tomorrow morning, retain you as legal counsel to the Bank of Hallam and Sons, at an annual retainer of $3,000 for a term of 5 years, in consideration of which the sealed letter currently in your possession will be delivered to me this evening for safekeeping in the bank's own iron vault, where it will be retrieved tomorrow morning at the reading and delivered to you at the head of the library table in the unbroken condition in which it is delivered to me tonight." He had said, "Mr. Knox, this is a serious offer, made by serious men, and it does not require you to break the seal on the letter or to disclose its contents." He had said, "Mr. Knox, I am asking you to take it." Mortimer had looked at the folded sheet of paper. He had not picked it up. He had said, "Mr. Beasley, I have known you for 31 years, and your wife has been a member of my own church choir for 26 of them, and your daughter Anne taught at the same Sunday school as my own late wife in the year before my wife died, and I am very sorry to be sitting on the other side of this desk from you tonight on this errand." He had said, "Mr. Beasley, the letter is not going to leave my coat." He had said, "The letter is going to be read aloud tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock in the front library of the Hallam House, in front of you and the Reverend Holcomb and the 3 sons and their wives and 1 Orc woman, and you are going to hear what is in it at the same time everybody else does, and you're going to wish on Sunday morning that you had not come to my office tonight." He had said, "Go home, Mr. Beasley. Tell the 3 sons of Cyrus Hallam that you delivered their message and that I declined it." Mr. Beasley had stood up. He had said in a voice that was very low, "Mr. Knox, I am sorry." Mortimer had said, "Mr. Beasley, I know you are." Mr. Beasley had walked out. Mortimer had picked up the folded sheet of paper after Mr. Beasley had gone, and he had read it, and he had put it into the inside breast pocket of his coat beside the sealed envelope. And he had sat at his desk in the dimming light of the late spring evening, and he had thought, in a way he had not permitted himself to think in the previous 4 days, about the kind of son a man could raise across 40 years of careful daily work, and about the kind of son that careful daily work could nevertheless fail to produce, and about the document in his coat pocket which was about to become the only honest account in this town of the kind of man Cyrus Hallam had actually been, and he had thought about Cyrus's late wife Sarah, whom he had loved at a distance for the entirety of her marriage, and whose own honest account of her husband he had been carrying around inside himself for 31 years without ever once mentioning it to anyone. He had ridden to the Hallam house in the morning. Thessa of the Cold Fern clan walked up the front path of the Hallam house at 5 minutes to 11. She was a tall, slim Orc woman in her middle 50s, with bright, vivid emerald green skin the color of wet ivy in winter, long black hair tied back in a single thick braid, streaked with 3 thin lines of silver at the temple, and the careful, upright bearing of a woman who had walked 4 blocks in her one good dress to a house she had been formally summoned to, and who did not know what she was about to be told inside it. She wore a long, dark gray wool dress to the ankles, brushed clean for the occasion. She carried a small black cloth bag in her right hand. She had been at the forge in her own small smithy at the edge of town until 8 that morning, finishing a set of horseshoes for a teamster who needed them by Monday, and she had walked home in the soot of the morning's work and washed her hands and her face and her hair in cold water at her own dry sink, and she had changed into the dark gray dress, and she had walked the 4 blocks to the Hallam house at the time her letter from Mr. Knox the lawyer had told her to be there. The letter had not said why. The letter had said only that her presence was requested at the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Cyrus Hallam at the Hallam house at 11 o'clock on the morning of Saturday the 8th of May. She had read the letter 4 times. She had not slept well on Friday night either. She had walked up the path. Mrs. Prine, the housekeeper, had opened the front door at her knock and had said, in the careful, courteous voice of a Welsh housekeeper of 30 years' standing, "Good morning, ma'am. Please come in." Thessa had said, "Good morning." She had stepped into the front hall. The senior clerk, Mr. Beasley, had been standing in the hall in his black wool funeral coat and had not looked at her. The Reverend Holcomb had been standing beside Mr. Beasley and had nodded at her in the small grave way ministers nod at people whose presence they do not entirely understand at moments like this. Mortimer Knox had come out of the front library at the sound of her arrival and had walked across the hall to her, and he had said, in a voice she could hear was steady, "Mrs. Coldfern." Thessa had said, "Mr. Knox." He had said, "Please come in. Thank you for coming." He had taken her into the front library. He had shown her to her place at the foot of the long mahogany table. He had said, "Your place is here at this end, Mrs. Coldfern." He had said, "The reading will begin in 2 minutes." He had said, "Please sit." She had sat. The 3 sons of Cyrus Hallam had been already seated along the long sides of the table, the eldest Edgar on the left side near the head, the middle Floyd on the left side beyond him, the youngest Henry on the right side opposite Edgar, and the 3 wives of the 3 sons beside them. Mr. Beasley and the Reverend Holcomb had taken the two remaining chairs after Thessa had been seated. Mortimer had walked to the head of the table. He had set down the empty leather portfolio. He had taken from the inside breast pocket of his black wool funeral coat the sealed envelope that had been against his ribs for 92 hours. He had set the envelope on the mahogany of the table in front of him. He had looked once around the room. Edgar Hallam had looked at the envelope. Floyd Hallam had looked at the envelope. Henry Hallam, the youngest, had looked at Mortimer's face. Mortimer had taken from the same pocket a small folding penknife. He had said, "The will and testament of Cyrus Phelps Hallam, dated the 18th of September of the previous year, drawn up at his direction by Mortimer Knox of the Pine Brook Bar in the presence of two witnesses, was filed in its final form with the Territorial Probate Court at the Capitol on September 22nd and has been on record there for the past 8 months." He said, "The document I am about to read to you is the sealed companion letter attached to the will, which Mr. Hallam directed at the same sitting to be read aloud, in its entirety, at the will reading, in the presence of all named beneficiaries." He said, "The document is at this moment unbroken." He said, "I am breaking the seal in your presence." He slit the seal of the envelope with a small folding penknife. He slid out the contents. The contents were 4 pages of careful handwriting in dark fountain pen ink in the hand of Cyrus Hallam himself. Mortimer began to read. He read the letter in the slow, even voice of a country lawyer who had read a great many documents aloud in front of a great many families on a great many mornings, and who had been preparing this particular reading for 8 months. The letter opened in the formal address Cyrus had used for legal documents all his life, "To the named beneficiaries of my last will and testament, on the morning of my burial." The letter said, "I am 67 years old as I write this. I have been the founder and the principal stockholder of the Bank of Hallam and Sons of Pine Brook for 46 years. I have 3 sons, all of whom I love, and one of whom may understand this letter. I have one debt left unpaid in this life, to a person not present in this room when I sat down to write this letter, but who will be present in this room when this letter is read aloud. I am writing the letter because I am not going to be able to pay the debt in my own person before I die, and because I do not trust my sons to pay it for me unless I require them to, in writing, with witnesses present, and with the Territorial Probate Court behind me." The letter described in 4 careful pages the events of a particular night in the autumn of 1873, 14 years before, in the 3rd month of the final illness of Cyrus's wife, Sarah Hallam. The doctor in Pine Brook had been 3 days' ride away at the territorial capital for a medical conference. Sarah Hallam had taken a sudden bad turn on the evening of the 3rd day. Cyrus had sent his stable boy at full gallop to fetch any doctor between Pine Brook and the capital who could come. The stable boy had not yet returned. Sarah had been lying in her bed in the upstairs back bedroom, unable to keep her eyes open and unable to speak more than 3 words at a time. And Cyrus had been sitting in the chair beside her bed, in his shirt sleeves, with his hands folded between his knees, and he had thought, and the letter said this in plain language, that he was going to lose his wife that night without having said to her the things he had been intending to say to her since the year of their marriage. There had been a knock at the back kitchen door. The cook of that period, a woman named Mrs. Home, long since dead, had answered the door. At the back kitchen door had been an orc woman with bright green skin and a long black braid, soaking wet from a heavy late autumn rain, carrying a small clay jar wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. The orc woman had said her name was Thessa of the Cold Fern. She had said her husband Rome worked at the foundry which had sold the bank a quantity of iron the previous month, and she had heard that day at the market that Mrs. Hallam was very ill. She had said her clan, the Cold Fern, had a particular preparation that the women of her people brewed in iron pots for the kind of illness she had heard Mrs. Hallam was suffering from, and that the preparation did not cure, but brought the person it was given to a measure of clear-headed time at the end. She had said she had walked 4 miles in the rain to bring the jar, and that she would not enter the house, and that she would leave the jar on the back step and walk home, and that this was a gift and that there was no payment. She had set the jar on the back step. She had bowed to Mrs. Holm. She had walked back the way she had come. Mrs. Holm had brought the jar inside. She had set the jar in Cyrus's hand. Cyrus had stood in the back bedroom of his own house with the small clay jar wrapped in wet oilcloth in his hand, and he had thought for a long moment about whether to give the contents to his dying wife. And he had unwrapped the oilcloth, and he had taken the lid off the jar, and he had smelled the contents, which had smelled of bitter herbs and of iron and of nothing he recognized, and he had decided. He had given Sarah a small spoonful. He had given her another small spoonful 2 hours later. By the third spoonful at 6 in the morning, Sarah had opened her eyes and had asked him in a clear voice for a cup of tea. The letter said, Sarah lived for 3 more weeks. I sat in the chair beside her bed for the entire 3 weeks. She had a clear head for all of it. We said the things to each other that we had not said in 30 years of marriage. She told me what she wanted me to know about my own life. I told her what I had been intending to tell her since the year of our wedding. I had 3 weeks of my wife at the end of her life that I would not have had without the small clay jar from the back step. Mortimer had read this paragraph aloud in the slow, even voice he had been using, and he had paused at the end of it, and he had looked once down the long mahogany table at Thessa of the Cold Fern, who was sitting at the foot of the table with her green hands folded in her lap, and her dark eyes lowered and her face entirely still. Mortimer had read on. The letter said, I never spoke of the jar to my sons because I could not find the way to speak of it. I never spoke of the jar to Thessa of the Cold Fern because she had asked for no payment, and I had understood that to attempt payment would be to misunderstand what the gift had been. I let her husband, Rome, carry a small mortgage with my bank at the lowest rate of interest the bank allowed. And after his death in the foundry fire of 1875, I let his widow Thessa pay the mortgage down at whatever rate she could manage. And I did not call the mortgage when she fell behind, because I had not yet found the way to speak of it. I am not going to find the way now. I am going to do in this letter the next nearest thing. The letter said, in the same careful hand, I, Cyrus Phelps Hallam, on this 18th day of September of the present year, in the full possession of my faculties, do hereby direct the executor of my estate to release in full and forever the outstanding mortgage of $340.17 currently held by the Bank of Hallam and Sons against the smithy lot at the eastern edge of the town of Pine Brook, in the name of the late Rome of the Cold Fern, and the current Thessa of the Cold Fern, and to issue to Thessa of the Cold Fern a deed of full clear title to the said lot, and to deposit in addition into the personal account of Thessa of the Cold Fern at the said bank the sum of $3,000 from the cash assets of my personal estate, which sum shall be unencumbered, and which shall not be subject to challenge by any other beneficiary of this will. The letter said, "The cash assets of my personal estate are not the assets of the bank, and the residue of my personal estate after this disbursement is fully sufficient to satisfy the bequests to my 3 sons, as set out in the body of the will, and any objection to this disbursement on the grounds of insufficient residue is by my direct instruction to be ruled out of order by the executor on the spot." The letter said, "My 3 sons are receiving the bank between them in the body of the will. My 3 sons are receiving the house and the land and the bank stock between them in the body of the will. My 3 sons are receiving between them an inheritance very considerably larger than any inheritance they have earned. They are not receiving an honest account of their father unless this letter is read aloud, and so I have required it to be read aloud on the morning of my funeral, in the presence of the woman who walked 4 miles in the rain in October of 1873 with a clay jar wrapped in oilcloth." The letter said, "To Thessa of the Cold Fern, who is sitting in this room as this letter is read, I have wanted to thank you for 14 years. I did not find the way. I have done what I could in this letter. The bank will not call the mortgage. The bank will not call the mortgage in the lifetimes of my sons, or in the lifetimes of their sons, or ever. Your smithy is your smithy. It always was." Mortimer had read the final sentences of the letter in the same slow, even voice. He had set the 4 pages on the mahogany of the table. He had looked up. Edgar Hallam had been looking at the table. Floyd Hallam had been looking at the wall. Henry Hallam, the youngest, the one studying law in the Capitol, had been looking at Thessa at the foot of the table, and his eyes had been wet. Thessa of the Cold Fern had not raised her face. Her green hands had remained folded in her lap. After a long moment, she had said, in a low voice that was steady and clear, "Mr. Knox." Mortimer had said, "Mrs. Cold Fern." Thessa had said, "Please read the last paragraph again." He had read the last paragraph again. Thessa had nodded once. Then she had said, in the same low, steady voice, "Mr. Hallam was a kind man." She had said, "I am very sorry he is dead." She had said, "Please excuse me." She had stood up from her chair. She had walked the length of the long mahogany table without looking at any of the 3 sons or any of their wives or Mr. Beasley or the Reverend Holcomb or Mortimer Knox, and she had walked out of the front library, and she had walked through the front hall, and she had walked out of the front door of the Hallam house, and she had walked the 4 blocks back to her own small smithy at the eastern edge of the town of Pine Brook, and she had taken off her one good dress, and had hung it on the wooden peg behind the back door of the smithy, and she had put on her work apron, and she had built up the fire in the forge, and she had finished the set of horseshoes for the teamster who needed them by Monday. Edgar Hallam tried to contest the codicil in territorial probate court the following month. The judge of the territorial probate court at the Capitol was an old man named Ardmore, who had known Cyrus Hallam personally for 30 years. Judge Ardmore had read the 4 pages of the letter. Judge Ardmore had read the 11th clause of the will. Judge Ardmore had ruled from the bench that the codicil was the clearest and most carefully executed instrument of testamentary intent that had crossed his bench in the previous decade, and that any further attempt by the petitioners to challenge it would be regarded by the court as bad faith litigation against a deceased testator and would be sanctioned accordingly. Edgar Hallam had not appealed. The $3,000 had been deposited into Thessa of the Cold Ferns account at the Bank of Hallam and Sons on the following Monday morning by the senior clerk, Mr. Beasley, who had walked to her smithy in his lunch hour to deliver the deposit slip in person and to apologize in a low private voice at the door of her forge for the part he had played on the Friday evening. Thessa had not spoken to him. She had taken the deposit slip and had nodded once and had returned to her work. Mr. Beasley had walked back to the bank. He had retired the following spring and had moved to live with his daughter in the next county and had not returned to Pine Brook. Henry Hallam, the youngest son, had finished his year of law studies in the capital and had returned to Pine Brook to work in Mortimer Knox's law office. He had not gone into the bank. He had not spoken to his brothers for the next 8 years. He had married, at 38, the daughter of the Reverend Holcomb, and they had named their first son Cyrus. Edgar and Floyd Hallam had inherited the bank between them. They had run it for 19 years. They had run it competently. They had not run it as their father had run it. Thessa of the Cold Fern had worked the smithy at the eastern edge of Pine Brook for the next 27 years. She had paid no further mortgage. She had taken on in the second year an apprentice named Veska, her late husband Rolm's nephew, who came down from the foothills to learn the trade. Veska had married a Cold Fern woman of the foundry, and they had raised 4 children at the smithy lot. And the smithy lot had become, over those 27 years, a small Cold Fern household at the eastern edge of a human town. Thessa had died of old age in the autumn of 1914, at the age of 82, in a small bed in the back room of the smithy with Veska and his family around her, and she had been buried in the small Cold Fern plot at the eastern edge of the smithy lot, beside her husband Rolm. The smithy was still standing on the eastern edge of Pine Brook 104 years later. The lot had never been called. The mortgage book of the Bank of Hallam and Sons on the line for the smithy lot had carried Cyrus's careful handwritten notation in dark fountain pen ink, dated the same 18th of September of the previous year as the letter which had read, "Released in full, by direction of the principal stockholder." Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Orc Keeper.